A reading from the book of John in chapter 20, verses 11 through 18. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. And she saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" And she thought Jesus was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father, but go find my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." And then she gave them his message. I want to tell you a story. And it starts with a cynical person on a bench in a shopping mall on a Saturday in 2006. And it ends with a hopeful person on a bench in a shopping mall on a Saturday in 2006. In 2006, I'd been married for a few years. And since 2 years before that, since 2004, I had been walking away from the Christian faith that I was handed as a child. I had all kinds of questions, both philosophical and historical, about the validity of Christianity. I also had seen church scandals play out in the news, and I had struggles with God and the problem of evil, and I had started walking away from my Christian faith. But my wife wanted to go to the mall that Saturday, and so we did. In 2006, I would oftentimes go with her, again, young, kind of newlywed still. We'd walk through whatever store she wanted to walk through until I got tired of walking through stores and shopping. And then I would volunteer, out of my great love for her, to go sit on a bench in front of the store, to protect her, to watch the door in case any shady characters walked in. And so she said that was fine. Now, in 2006, there's no iPhone. So there was nothing to pull out of your pocket and doom scroll with to pass the time. So you just had to sit there alone with your thoughts. It was horrifying. And so I'm sitting on this bench in 2006, and I'm about to do what I typically would do at a mall if I'm sitting on a bench, which is to watch people, because watching people can be quite hilarious. It's fun to watch people at the mall because it's fun to judge people at the mall. And that's kind of where your mind goes. Hopefully you catch someone, like if you can catch a married couple in a fight at the mall, that's always the most fun for me at that point, because usually he doesn't realize that they're in a fight yet, right? So I remember seeing a couple, she's walking like 5 feet ahead of him, and he like runs up to her, and he's like, I was like, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I said I'm fine." And he said, "It doesn't sound like you're fine." And she said, "Look, I just wanted to come to the mall and browse around. I didn't want to watch you try on 17 pairs of cargo shorts like it was an episode of Project Runway for dads." He said, "You said take your time." I took my time. That is literally what those words mean. And she said, "How does it take that much time to decide between beige and slightly less beige?" And he said, "You looked at throw pillows at Crate and Barrel for 25 minutes, and we don't even throw pillows." And she said, "Those throw pillows had tassels. I was having a tassel moment." This was great. You're just sitting over there like, yes, I'm so glad I'm not the one in this fight right now. So I went to sit on this bench to watch people, and if I'm being honest, to judge people. But what happened instead was I ended up having a life-transforming experience on that bench that I was not anticipating. And I'm going to tell you about that a little bit later today. But before I do, I want to give some context for what today is. Today is, on the one hand, and it's okay for you to have a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about this when I say it, today is Easter Sunday. Yeah. Where Christians celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so on the one hand, that's what today is. But on the other hand, I thought today might be a really good opportunity for me to sit down with you as if we were at a coffee shop and to have a conversation. I haven't always been super into coffee. I grew up in East Texas, and Starbucks didn't get there until the early 2000s. And so I didn't grow up, when I was in high school, I didn't have like a vernacular for how to order coffee. Oh, thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. And so I had to learn this when I was an adult. I had to learn how to order at Starbucks because no one had ever taught me. I'd never actually had the opportunity. And so I learned from a 14-year-old student who was related to me. And they said, oh, when you go to Starbucks and you feel dumb, you should order an upside-down caramel macchiato. And I like the sound of that. That sounded fancy, like I knew what I was doing. So I tried that a few times, and it worked. And it turns out I liked that drink a lot because it was loaded with sugar. And so I did it in front of friends. I looked sophisticated. And then one day I remember I was in a bookstore with some friends, and they had like a little coffee shop in the bookstore. And so we all went up to order coffee, and they all made their orders. And then I got up and proudly proclaimed that I would like a upside-down caramel macchiato, please. And the barista said, dude, this isn't Starbucks. I have no idea what that is. What's even in that drink? And that's when I realized the only word I understood in that whole order was the word caramel. So I said, I'll just take a black coffee, please. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Now, since then, my tastes have grown because some friends and even a coffee shop owner have invested in me over the years. I now enjoy lots of even non-sugary drinks, espressos and Americanos. I love French presses and single origin pour-overs and cold brews. They are all great. But the thing I love about coffee the most is that some conversations are so important, they can only happen over coffee. And so I thought today would be a great opportunity for us to sit down and have a chat over some coffee, where if you were to ask me, Josh, after almost walking away from Christianity years ago, after struggling with the doubts and the questions, after seeing church scandals in the news and seeing the rise of religious fundamentalists and Christian nationalists, like, why are you still a Christian? Why do you still believe? Or maybe why do you believe again? If you were to ask me that question over a cup of coffee, my answer would be something like what we're going to discuss this morning. I'm just going to use a few more props than I would be able to at a coffee shop. The first thing I might do is actually turn to this story of this woman, Mary, in the book of John, who's at the empty tomb and she is weeping. In fact, it's notable that she's weeping because the angels say, woman, why are you weeping? And then moments later, Jesus, who she doesn't know is Jesus, says, woman, why are you weeping? And you got to think Mary's like, okay, why is everybody asking me that question, right? I'm weeping obviously because my friend, my mentor, my rabbi, the one who started this movement, I mean, she had been in a life of tragedy, mired, and she got pulled up by Jesus and his disciples, and she joined the band. They traveled together. She listened, and she took in this new way of life that Jesus invited her into. And so this is a man who she loves, has great affection for. He has changed her life, and he is dead. And to add insult to injury, now his body isn't even there anymore. And so she's heartbroken, of course. But there's one other way that I think she's heartbroken that may not be as obvious. And this is why Mary's story is my story. And it's why Mary's story is perhaps your story as well. She's been a part of this movement that changed her life, and therefore she has identified with this movement. And with the death of Jesus, the thing she knows for sure is that this movement is dead. And therefore, there's a part of her that's dead. And in this story, she is literally on the outside looking in. She's outside the tomb, peering in to what she hoped would be there, and his body is gone. You ever felt like that before? I remember in 2004 when I started walking away from Christianity, it felt like I was on the outside looking into it at something I hoped would be there, something I hoped would be beautiful, and it was like it was gone. I didn't see it anymore. And what I learned over the next couple of years of exploring and discovery is that the challenge wasn't just that what I hoped would be there was gone, it was that it needed to be replaced with something else entirely. Like Mary in this story, I needed to see Jesus with fresh eyes because it turns out he was in front of me the whole time, and I didn't recognize him. Perhaps it's because I, like some of you, grew up in church. I grew up in a Christian background, a more traditional environment, and when I was a kid, there was a version of Jesus that I was introduced to, and we'll just call him Cardboard Jesus, okay? This version of Jesus is amazing, by the way, partly because of the historical accuracy. Like in the first century in the ancient Near East, there were so many blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girls who would just run around, and Jesus loved them all. It was beautiful. I was introduced to a version of Jesus like this. It was a version meant for a child, right? Like that's what we do with children. We introduce them to the concepts that are fit for their size and for their age. And so I was introduced to the Jesus who loves the children and hugs the children and loves the people and is great. And this was really great, but the older I got, the more literally two-dimensional this felt. And so when I started to walk away from Christianity, this is kind of the version of Jesus that I was walking away from. It just seemed like he's fine, but like I don't know that he has much for me now that I'm in my 20s. So in 2004 and 2005 and in early 2006, I started reading the Gospels more occasionally, just to check. I was checking a lot of world religions and even different views on agnosticism and atheism. Like I was really interested. I was reading a ton, but I decided at some point to go back to the Gospels and really read the stories of Jesus. And what I discovered is that the Jesus as presented in the New Testament is so surprising and so funny and so provocative. In Mark chapter 1, it's the very beginning of this gospel, and there's this person with leprosy. Leprosy was like a skin disease, and probably any type of skin disease got lumped into the leprosy category. But leprosy was a terrible disease, not just because of what it did to your body, but because of what it did to you socially. So if you had leprosy, people were afraid it was highly contagious. And we actually know now that it wasn't nearly as contagious as people thought that it was. But then they were afraid that if you were around it, certainly if you touched someone with it, like you might get it, and then you would be cast out of the community, because if you had leprosy, you had to live outside of the city in a leper colony because nobody wanted to be around you. And if you were Jewish, like Jesus was, if you were an Israelite, you then were ceremonially unclean because of your leprosy, and therefore you weren't able to go and worship in the Jewish temple. So you were an outcast in society. You were an outcast of your own religious tradition. Like it was social death to be a leper. And early on, there's a leper who approaches Jesus Christ, and he is with, we assume, other people, and these other people would have probably been losing their minds that a person with leprosy was coming anywhere close to them. And it seems that he's maybe at a distance from Jesus, and he's crying out for Jesus to help him. And he says that, like, Jesus, you can take this away from me if you will it. Mark says that Jesus is indignant. Now, if you're just there and you're present for the story, you might think he's indignant because how dare a leper dare come this close to this man, to this rabbi? But no, Jesus is indignant because the leper thinks there's a chance that Jesus won't want to heal him. And so he walks up to the man with leprosy and says, "If I will," and he touches him. This man received a physical touch from Jesus for probably the first time any human being has touched him in years. And in doing so, Jesus heals his leprosy, but he also heals his soul. Because the Jesus we find in the Gospels is a Jesus who's willing to touch the untouchable, a Jesus who's willing to cross all of the boundaries that we draw, because that's what love does. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus is talking to this group of Jewish people who are gathered for a reading of the scripture of Isaiah, and he's essentially saying that what Isaiah predicted, that there would be a Messiah, a Savior to come and help Israel, like it's fulfilled today in me. And the people, we don't love that. Like, what are you talking about? Who are you trying to say that you are? But then he goes way beyond that, and he says, just like Elijah and Elisha helped non-Jews, they helped Gentiles, I'm called to do that as well. So he's going to be the freedom of Israel, but he's going way beyond Israel and saying, like, actually, I'm God's salvation for the whole world. And that's the thing that sparked their fury. They were so angry that they riot and they try to kill him. Why? Because Israel's God was saving the wrong people. And of course, we see that darkness in our own heart as well, that we want people who are like us and in our group and think like us. We want them to be protected. We want them to have access to all the good stuff. And for the other people, they're on their own. But Jesus was transnational in the way that he thought about God's salvation, that this was for everybody, because that's what love does. There's a woman with an issue of blood. She's been bleeding for 12 years. She's gone to lots of doctors. They can't help her. She can't stop the bleeding. Just like the man with leprosy, this means that she won't be able to be in polite society. She's ostracized from the temple, ostracized from people, because she is ceremonially unclean. And she can't be around others because if she touches them as an unclean person, they'll be unclean as well. So she is desperate, and she hears that Jesus is coming to town, and Jesus is a miracle worker, and maybe he can heal her, but she's also ashamed and embarrassed by her condition, and so she goes out into this massive crowd that's following Jesus around, and she knows that that's wrong, because if she touches someone, she'll defile them, and they won't even know it, and she's so desperate that she follows him around, and she thinks, maybe if I can just touch the hem of his garment, maybe I can be healed. And so that's what she does. She essentially sneaks up behind him, touches the hem of his garment, and she's healed instantly. And Jesus, the story tells us, feels power go out of him. And he looks at his disciples and says, who touched me just now? Which is an insane question because there's like 500 people gathered around and it's like we're all at a rave, Jesus. I have no idea who, could have been anybody. So Jesus turns around and he sees her and knows it's her. And he locks eyes with her and forces her to talk to him. And you know she just wants to melt into the ground at this point. Oh my goodness, I just wanted to be healed. I didn't want any attention. I'm so embarrassed. If he knows I'm here, if he knows my issue, if he knows I just defiled him by touching him, he is going to be furious. He is going to call me out in front of all of these people. All of her worst nightmares are about to be confirmed. And instead, Jesus looks at her. And the only time we see this in all of the gospel, he lovingly calls her daughter. 12 years of bleeding, 12 years of hiding, one moment of faith, and Jesus calls her daughter. She thought she was forgotten. Jesus declares that she is family, because that's what love does. There's a woman who's caught in adultery, and this woman is brought to Jesus. And these religious leaders throw her at his feet, and they say, this woman was caught in adultery. And as you know, the law of Moses allows us to stone those who were caught in adultery. By the way, side note here, to catch someone in adultery really requires catching two people in adultery. The man they did not bring. He apparently got a get out of stoning free card, okay? So he's not there. But they brought her, why? Because they wanted to show the people that either Jesus was ruthless or Jesus was going to refuse to follow the Mosaic law. Either way, they were trying to discredit him. So Jesus looks at this woman, and then he starts to write in the sand. And we don't actually know what he wrote in the dirt there. There's all kinds of interesting theories. We don't have time to talk about them this morning. But at the conclusion of writing in the sand, he stands up and he says, anyone here who is without sin can throw the first stone. And one by one, they walk away in disgust and humiliation. So it's just him and it's her. And you can imagine she is probably cowering, like hands over her head. She actually is not seeing, she has no idea what's happening right now. And he says, woman, who is there who is left to condemn you? She looks around and much to her surprise, she's able to respond, no one. And he says, then neither do I condemn you. Go now and sin no more. The only one who was without sin was the only one who was unwilling to throw a stone. Because that is what love does. So I started to read about this Jesus. And while this was a Jesus fit for a child, it wasn't a Jesus that was nearly as surprising or funny or provocative as the one that I discovered in the Gospels. And I started to realize, like much like Mary, that my issue, the reason I was starting to walk away, wasn't because of Jesus. It was because of a version of Jesus I was handed as a child that was a great version of Jesus for a child, but that didn't fit into my adult understanding of the world. And so I saw Jesus with fresh eyes. But that didn't mean, of course, that Jesus was true, that the story of Jesus was true, or that it was the answer. And in fact, I was so taken aback by the moral teachings of Jesus that I started wondering, like, was he really that distinct? Was he that different in the first century, his moral teachings, or was this just kind of the way that people were thinking at that point? So I started to read more and more about the Roman Empire, and it was fascinating because the Romans contributed so much to the world. I mean, they roads and aqueducts and education and the spreading of the empire, and the Pax Romana was also the peace of Rome. They had a republic where they had like actual senators who would have debates and try to do what was best for the people until Caesar took control, and they never quite got that back. But like they were a fascinating civilization. And I thought, like, is the stuff that Jesus was teaching in the way that he was inviting people to live, is it really that different than the way Romans would have thought? And it turns out absolutely it is. In fact, and this wasn't available at the time I was looking through this, but even a few years ago, a book was written by a historian named Tom Holland. Not the guy who plays Spider-Man, different Tom Holland, okay? This is a guy who's probably written as many helpful books about the history of Rome as anyone else in modern day history, like really, really great stuff. And he got curious at one point as to the ethical teachings and the morality of Rome. Because the way that we think about human dignity and value in the West has been majorly influenced by someone or something, and he wanted to know, is Roman society part of the reason we think about people the way that we do today? And what he found was that the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana, was only peace depending on which side of the sword that you were on. If you were on the side with the sword, then it really felt like peace because you were just using your sword to expand the kingdom and to keep peace. But if you were being invaded by the Romans, it didn't feel like peace at all. By the way, this looks kind of cool, but this is the dullest sword I've ever seen. It's like a very large letter opener, so don't be worried if you're in the front row. I could drop it on your head and it wouldn't hurt. So the peace of Rome ended up being peaceful for those holding the sword, but not so much for those who weren't. And in fact, Rome believed in might. In fact, we have quotes from that period of time which essentially say things like, the strong will do what they will, and the weak will suffer what they must. This idea that if you're strong, great, you're wonderful, and if you're weak, that's just who you are. Sorry. Tough stuff, Buttercup. That's what it said in the original Greek. Over and against this backdrop, Jesus teaches humility. He says that the first will be last and the last will be first. That was not the way that the Romans thought about it whatsoever. They emphasized power and authority, and those who could take charge should take charge. Over and against that backdrop, Jesus says to love your enemies and bless those who persecute you. Shocker, but that's not the way that Rome thought about their enemies. It was crush your enemies, do away with anyone who would do anything negative to you. Over against this backdrop of Rome, Jesus says that each and every human is created in the image of God, and therefore they have infinite worth and infinite value because of how they were created. And so everybody is worthy of dignity, which, by the way, as a culture, as a society in 2025, here in the West, we pretty much believe that. But we don't believe it because lots of people have been teaching it for thousands of years. We believe it because the teachings of Jesus have so infiltrated our mindset that to think otherwise seems barbaric to us. And Tom Holland, who is not a Christian, he is a secular historian, traces that impulse that we have for human rights and human dignity and human equality. He traces it back not to a wonderful, glorious empire, but to the moral teachings of a first century Jewish rabbi who was crucified by an empire. What Jesus taught has infiltrated all of us. It's changed all of us, whether you believe in Jesus or not. It's just the air you breathe. It's the water you swim in. You can be unaware of it and still be highly impacted by it. Now, none of that, even though I think all that's provable, like Tom Holland and others have done a great job of laying that out, none of that, though, proves that Christianity is true. Because Christianity doesn't just teach that Jesus was a great moral teacher. Lots of people can admire the teachings of Jesus, but Christianity goes far beyond that. Christianity says that the one who taught us this beautiful way to be human didn't just live a good life, but that he's still alive. And if that's true, then Jesus isn't just a past event, but a present invitation. So what about the resurrection? Not just like, is it interesting, but is it true? Did it really happen? Mary ends up being the very first person to see Jesus alive. She wasn't expecting it. He was dead. He was gone. She was mourning. She was sad. This movement is over. And then with fresh eyes, she sees this person she thought was the gardener is actually Jesus and realized he's back. He is raised from the dead. And if that's true, it changes everything, because if Jesus actually rose from the dead, then Christianity isn't just interesting or morally helpful. Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, I would say it has tectonic, life-shifting implications for everybody. Now, this message is not primarily about historical evidence or proof that the resurrection actually happened. But I do this morning, I just want to share with you two things that I personally found very persuasive and compelling as I was looking through this years ago. One historical and one that's more personal. Here's the historical. Back in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, there were a number of non-Christian secular scholars who started to believe that perhaps Jesus never even existed in the first place, that he was just a mythical figure that some people attached to and started writing stories about in the first century. Now, that was never a majority view, but there was a growing movement of it. But throughout the 20th century, the more documents we got a hold of and the more investigating we did, that's just not a tenable position anymore. So at this point, both Christian and secular scholars, people who have no particular religious belief, do not necessarily prop up Christianity, both religious and secular scholars, believe at the very minimum that Jesus existed, that he was a first century rabbi, that he was murdered by the Roman Empire, and that his earliest followers believed he had risen from the dead. Now, even scholars like Paula Fredrickson or Bart Ehrman, who are wonderful scholars, not Christians, but wonderful scholars, have to solve then for the question, how is it that a bunch of people in the first century believed that this guy raised from the dead? And so if you start to study the literature, what you'll find is that a lot of these people don't think that the disciples just made it up. Why? Well, they gave their lives for it. Many of them were willing to die for this belief. And people usually don't die for a lie. So what do they think? Well, Bart Ehrman says that he believes that these early disciples believed that they had had an encounter with Jesus Christ who had risen. That it was some type of mass psychosis, that they all believed it, they all had a similar experience, and that was how they interpreted that experience. But of course, he's committed to the idea that people don't raise from the dead, so it couldn't have happened, it must have been a mass psychosis. The thing is, historically, we don't have any other mass psychosis in the history of humanity that made a group of people simultaneously believe that someone who was dead was now alive again. And certainly not to the scale of this. This isn't just the 12 apostles. This is also Paul, who actually was against the church until he experienced a risen Jesus. Paul says that hundreds of people experienced Jesus at the same time in his letter in 1 Corinthians. And so there were way beyond 12 people that believed this. So this is a level of mass psychosis we don't have evidence for anywhere else in human history. So the challenge is this. You have a bunch of conservative Jewish people in the first century who are somehow convinced that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he was crucified and raised from the dead. None of those people would have believed, A, that a human could be God, or B, that God would somehow suffer on a cross, or C, that he would raise from the dead. That wasn't a belief that they shared. So in their Jewish history, they are now believing something that is totally different from what they've been raised with. What happened to shift their belief system? You're left with two choices, basically. Either Jesus actually raised from the dead, or there was a mass psychosis event that a lot of people believed he was. Neither of these have we ever seen in recorded history before. So which one do you choose? Now, obviously, rational, reasonable people could choose differently. But for me, the thing that made the most sense was that Jesus actually raised from the dead. Now, I'm barely skimming the surface on this topic, but there's lots more here we could cover. I encourage you to look into it yourself if this is interesting to you. But that's how I started to believe that maybe this crazy thing, which is, let's just name it, it is incredible. I know it sounds nuts to say that someone could die and then live again. But I'm left with a bunch of bad options as to how to explain this phenomenon. And it leaves me thinking that maybe it just happened. That's the first thing that I found kind of persuasive. The second thing is a lot more personal. The second thing I found persuasive is the idea that if Jesus actually raised from the dead, if Jesus was able to find new life, then we can too. And I found this persuasive because I'd actually seen it played out a number of times in my life. My dad is a Christian musician and an evangelist. He's traveled around most of his adult life in the United States sharing Jesus with people. And even when I was struggling with whether any of this was true in my 20s, I still had a great deal of respect for my parents, both of whom were very strong believers. In the early 1980s, my dad got invited to come as a musician, a Christian musician from America, to Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the idea was that there was a number of missionaries in Sao Paulo, and they were trying to figure out how to get citizens of the city to get their attention so that they could share their testimony with them and share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. So they had musicians like my dad come, and they would play in a park, and then people would gather around when the Americans started playing guitar, because that was a bit of a novelty. We hadn't really seen that a lot. And again, it was the 80s, so there's no iPhone for everybody to just watch TikTok videos instead. So a musician in the park sounded amazing. So a bunch of people would gather, and then a missionary would get up, and they would tell people their testimony of following Jesus, and they would tell it in Portuguese. Well, my dad was there a couple of days, and he was happy to be used in the way he was being used. But he really wanted to be able to share his testimony with some of the citizens of Sao Paulo, but he didn't speak Portuguese. So late one night, before he goes to bed, he gets down on his knees at his bedside. And he's got a roommate he didn't really know very well, but he's also from the United States. And my dad just prays out loud, God, in the morning, when I wake up, I would like for two things. I would like to speak fluent Portuguese, and I would like to have access to a car. Amen. So he gets up and he sits down on the bed, and his roommate's just looking at him and goes, dude, what was that? He's like, well, I've been frustrated that I can't share my testimony with people because I don't speak the language. He was like, you think God's going to make you speak Portuguese? He was like, I don't know. Look, I think he could if he wanted to, so I thought I'd at least ask. He was like, okay, right on, man. So they go to sleep. My dad wakes up the next morning, sits up in bed, and his roommate is already awake and has a camera in his face, like pointed. And my dad's like, what are you doing? He said, I wanted to get a picture of you speaking Portuguese. My dad said, I think a picture of me speaking Portuguese would look a lot like a picture of me speaking English. He's like, I don't care, man, I just want to get it. So my dad wanted to see it too, so they both go into the bathroom together, and my dad looks in the mirror because he also wanted to see Portuguese come out of his mouth. And so he decides, here we go, and he starts speaking, and it's just the same old crummy East Texas English he's always spoken in. He was so disappointed. So that morning, the group of missionaries and musicians, they met together, and they had a little bit of a worship service before they were going to go out into the city. And my dad's leading the music that morning, but his heart's not really in it. Toward the end of that service together, about 100 people meeting, a guy walks in from the back. He's a shorter guy, about 5'5", and asks if he can have just a moment on the stage, and so they let him. He comes up and he introduces himself. His name is Dan, and he's a missionary. He's been a missionary for about 12 or 15 years in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he says, hey, fellas, I was praying last night, and as I was praying, I felt like God was telling me that someone in this group needed me today, and so I decided to come and visit with you. And if you feel like maybe you need me today, I just want you to know I'm here. I speak fluent Portuguese, and I have a car. So he goes and stands at the back. I'll be in the back if that's you. And my dad's like, okay, there's like 100 of us here. Probably 30 people prayed to speak fluent Portuguese last night, which just goes to show you how unself-aware my dad is. He's the only crazy person who would think to do that. So people like go past Dan and they shake his hand. So glad for the work that you're doing and that kind of thing. And then it's just my dad and Dan in the room, and that's it. So Dan looks up at my dad and he goes, you the one? My dad said, I think so. I prayed to speak Portuguese last night, and then I could have a car. And Dan goes, God works in mysterious ways. And so my dad walked with him out to his car, and he was so proud of this car because he had been without a car or with a really terrible car for years, and he'd been saving up, and people had been supporting his ministry. He was just able to get this new car, which was allowing him to speak to new people. He was so excited. So he's telling my dad about all the features, and in the 80s, that meant it ran and it had air conditioning. And so they're on this massive loop interstate thing outside of Sao Paulo to try to head in toward the city. And traffic is crazy. It's the 80s in Sao Paulo. There's almost no traffic laws that are enforced. People are going as fast as they want to, all over the place. Blinkers, no blinkers. It was like LA. And so they're all over the place, right? And so they start to share their testimonies a little bit with each other because my dad was excited about getting to share his testimony with some people today using Dan to translate. So my dad tells about his experience growing up and like how he found Jesus. And Dan tells my dad, like, yeah, I was a really angry young man, full of rage. He was like I had the worst road rage you could imagine. And then I found Jesus, and like that part of me died. And Jesus raised up something else so much better in its place. And it's just been like a beautiful, and I've wanted to share that experience that I have with everybody I can. That's why I'm a missionary now. So we're having this beautiful conversation. About the time that they're wrapping that section up, this giant water truck with no muffler, because again, there's very little regulation at this point, can't hear them. It moves over their lane without signaling at all, and it hooks their back bumper on Dan's front bumper, and now the vehicles are melded together, essentially. And so, like, Dan's trying to pull away, but it can't pull away. Like, they are stuck on that thing. So when that truck turns left, they turn left. When that truck turns right, they turn right. And Dan is honking, but they can't hear it because out over all the highway sound. And eventually, one of the guys sees it, and they pull over. And at this point, they've already scraped other cars. Like, they've hit, like, Dan's brand new car is just in tatters. It looks terrible. They pull over on the side of the highway there. And my dad looks over at Dan, and Dan just looks furious. Like, he's got a bulging vein. He just looks so angry. And he gets out of the car and slams it, and my dad's like, I think we're about to get into a fight. I think that's about to be what happens. And then 3 guys get out of that truck. My dad said they're 3 of the biggest guys he's ever seen in his life. They look like Coke machines with heads on them. So my dad gets out, and he's going behind Dan, and he's just thinking to himself, God, why couldn't you have sent me a bigger missionary? Like, this guy's not big enough to handle this. And so these guys get out, and they're all like kind of shoulder to shoulder, and Dan runs right up to them, and he sticks his finger in their face. He said, boys, have you ever made the life-changing decision to follow after Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? He turns to my dad and says, "Tell him your testimony." My dad, who was in this stance, goes, "Oh." My dad was there that day as three of the biggest guys he had ever seen in his life knelt on the side of the busiest highway he'd ever been on in his life and prayed, "El Señor, boss, come into my life and change me." And they gave their hearts to Jesus. And that happened because years before, an angry young man discovered the resurrection of Jesus Christ and found out that the angry part of him could be crucified just like Jesus was, and something new and beautiful could be raised up in its place. If Jesus was brought back to life, you can be too. I can be too. I want to tell you a story. And it starts with a cynical person on a bench in a shopping mall on a Saturday in 2006, and it ends with a hopeful person on a bench in a shopping mall on a Saturday in 2006. So I'm on the bench, and I'm about to do that cynical thing where I look out at other people and see their foibles and their arguments, and they're like, what? And I'm just going to judge them. I'm going to enjoy doing that. That's what I'm about to do. And then for whatever reason, as I'm ramping myself up for all of this delight, I think back to some of the stories that I've been reading about Jesus and the ways that I've been thinking about Jesus and trying to understand him as more three-dimensional and less two-dimensional. And I decided to say a little prayer. Now, for the last 2 years, I hadn't prayed very much, and so I wasn't even sure what to say. So this is what I prayed. I prayed, "Jesus, if you're real, help me to see these people the way you see them." And I didn't expect it, but over the next few minutes, it completely transformed my life. I saw a mom with a young son, and he was misbehaving and he was being very loud. And on most Saturdays, if I were sitting here, I would just take delight in judging her parenting technique. Now, I didn't have any children at the time, so at the time I assumed it was much easier than I would later find out it actually was. But I would be like, "Oh, it's like that mom, she can't control her children." Like, that's the kind of thoughts that would go into my head. But on that day, for reasons that are hard to articulate, I saw an exuberant child full of energy and an exhausted mom doing the best she could to help both control his energy and to redirect it. And I felt waves of compassion for what I was seeing. A few minutes later, because if you sit in a mall, you'll see this, there was a couple that walked by arguing, not surprisingly, not shockingly. And normally I would just, it was a popcorn moment to just like enjoy someone else's argument. But in this moment, what I saw was two people trying so hard to hold their ground in the argument while also somehow, even though it was killing them, somehow make space for the other. And there was beauty in the struggle. It was like everywhere I looked, I felt compassion. Like this couple in their fight, like this is not what they want to be doing, right? It's 2006. She wants to go to the wet sill to buy low-rise jeans. That's what she wants to do. He wants to buy cargo pants. Like this is not what they want. I wasn't expecting it, but what I found in that moment was a different way to see the world that was rooted in the faith of my childhood, but had taken on a completely new life of its own. I didn't start believing in Jesus and then finding a way to live. I started living like Jesus invited us to and discovered a way of life I never wanted to abandon. I don't know what feels like death to you. For some of us, it's like the weight of anxiety that hits our chest every Sunday night before Monday. We know we're starting a new week and we're going back to work and we're thinking about all the possibilities of what could go wrong. And just like Elizabeth, it feels like it's killing a part of us. And if Jesus found new life, you can too. For some of us, it's a relationship, maybe a marriage relationship, maybe one that already ended, maybe that one that feels like it's disintegrating. And it's tragic not just because of the tension it brings up in the day-to-day. It's tragic because you've invested so much in this person and so much in this relationship, so many hours of thinking about them and loving them well and talking with them and getting to know them and like opening yourself up to them. Like you've put your heart in this thing, and now that it's either gone or feels like it might be soon, it feels like a kind of death. And if Jesus found new life, you can too. That relationship might be able to as well. Or if that one's distant in the past, like you can heal from the hurt that you found. Perhaps it's getting so much success you literally don't know what to do because it doesn't feel as good as you'd hope. Perhaps it's feeling like you will never get the success you deserve. I don't know the ways that you feel dead, but I do know this, that if Jesus found new life, I believe you can too. And so this morning, for just a moment, I would love if you would, whether you're here in the room or if you're in our overflow right now, if you just bow your head and close your eyes for just a moment. And the reason I'm asking you to do this is because I just want to give you headspace for just a second to think. To not be distracted by lights or stage or any of that kind of stuff, or television monitors, like just a moment to think. And here's what I would just say, the invitation I would give to you. Like if something about this way of Jesus is compelling, not the cardboard cutout childhood, like the 3D true Jesus. If, like Mary, your eyes have been opened a little bit to who he is this morning. Maybe you've never followed him before, or maybe you followed cardboard Jesus years ago, and the Jesus you gave up on wasn't the Jesus of the Gospels, but that version you were handed as a child. There's a prayer that I'd invite you to pray with me this morning if you're ready to say, like, you know what, I do need new life. I do need to experience the resurrection that Jesus invites me into. The prayer is very simple, and in the next weeks and months, you'll have lots of conversations with God about all kinds of things, but this morning, I want to take all of it to a fine point and give you a very simple prayer that you can pray in your head or out loud where you sit right now. And it's simply this: Jesus, I give you my life. If you want to cross the line of faith today and say, man, I've considered it, I've been thinking about it, I've been on the precipice of I want to follow Jesus on this Easter Sunday of 2025. If you want to cross that line of faith, it's a prayer that's as simple as that. Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, I give you my life. And just see that new life can open up where old, dead things now sit. Jesus, I give you my life. And with your head still bowed and your eyes still closed, I'm not going to have you stand. I'm not going to try to embarrass you. You don't have to do anything else. I am going to ask you, though, if I could pray for you. And the way I'd like to do that is, like, if you prayed that prayer this morning, that Jesus, I give you my life prayer in your head or out loud, I just want to say a prayer of thanksgiving and a prayer of hope for you right now. So even if you're in overflow and I can't see you, I just think it's a good practice to lift your hand up, just to put a stake in the ground and say, I did that today. So right now, if you prayed that prayer this morning, can you just lift your hand so I can pray for you? Lift your hand, you can slip it right back down. Thanks, thank you so much. All over there, lift it up, you can slip it right back down. Thank you so much. Anybody else? I just want to pray for you, just want to lift you up. Anyone else? Yep, in the back there, I see that. Thank you so much in the middle. Yep, absolutely right here. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Anyone else? Yep, I see that. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate you trusting me with that. Heavenly Father, for every hand that was raised, for every person who prayed that they want to give you their life, I just lift them up to you. God, thank you that you're able to give us new life in the midst of our death, in the midst of our misdeeds, in the midst of our darkness, God, and our anxieties. And I just lift every single person up who raised their hand, God, that you would give them a boldness and a courage to step into the new life that you have for them, God. May we faithfully follow Jesus. May we recognize that today is not a finish line, but a starting place, a whole journey you have for us, and that our lives can be transformed and changed. The way we see other people, the way we see the world can be transformed and changed because of his beauty. And so, Lord, I pray that this first step is a good one, but that many more steps will follow. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hey, church, a bunch of people decided to take their first step into the kingdom of God this morning. Can we just welcome them warmly to his kingdom?